This slide is just a demonstration of how our expenditures have outpaced the organic revenue growth that Mr. David was talking about earlier. And you can see that all the years that the county was using fund balance to balance the budget, the expenditure line was above the actual revenues that were expected to come in. Those were practically one and the same last year as we came together. And then this year, without any additional tax revenue other than organic growth, we would be at that gap there. So that was the gap we had to bridge. The next slide shows a history of where the county has been spending its resources over the past few years. Mr. Frame had asked the other night about the areas of our spending, and I think you can see from this chart that education is an area that the county has continues to fund and is one that has been increasing over the last few years. Public safety is the number 2, and you can see that many of the other categories there have been level or have had a spike for one reason or another, but by far education and public safety is where our resources have gone. The next section is just an overview of the proposed budget, and you all have seen this before, but you remember that when we show these slides, we refer to the consolidated budget, which basically takes all of the funds and strips out the transfers between those funds so that you're looking at a net budget. So for instance, the general fund total budget is about $54 million, but here the transfers out to other funds has been stripped out. So you're looking at the true expenditures of the general fund there at 22.9. You can see that overall, with the school funds included, that we're at a bottom line consolidated budget of $93 million. And I've also left the insurance fund on here because I wanted you to realize that it is one that we're including in the budget this year, but because all the revenues are transfers from the other funds, that it nets out to a 0. So it's not, we're not doubling it up in our bottom line. This is just a snapshot of the consolidated budget in some different categories, showing you the totals compared to last year for county operations, school operations, total capital, and total debt service. You can see that the total increase is about 6.5%.
All right. What this next slide is something that I think I brought this in and introduced it to Glenda a couple weeks ago. I guess I'm a digital hoarder. I brought this from a budget about 10 years ago in Amherst County, but I felt it was a very useful tool for you all to have an ability in a live format as you go through the deliberations to run scenarios. Instead of, what happens if we do this with this cut or this tax levy. This is something that you actually can have, and you are provided copies of it. We will have it live on the screens and showed as an active spreadsheet. But and we've gone through the information. But the left side are the revenues. The right side are the categories of expenditures. The yield, the ledger is how much 1 penny on those levies generate, and then the bottom line is what the proposed tax rate, what the current is. In the far green is what the proposed rate is. And then you can see how much it generates, and then it ends up to the adjusted deficit of 0 so that we are balanced. And we'll go into that later during your work sessions. The next sheet is something that I distributed to you all a couple weeks ago, I guess it was. What I've characterized as the budget drivers. These are the plus-ups, the additional dollars above the base 2014 adopted budget. The green is what the white column is what's been requested, and the green is what's been proposed. I've targeted the high-level dollar, the high priority, either from an operations or a capital, and you can kind of work down this list, and they're color-coded, and if you change, these spreadsheets are linked, so if you change something in the proposed, it'll ripple through back to the balancer sheet. I'm not going to go line by line. That's something that we can do as you get through your work session, and certainly in my conversations with you this week, you understand what I'm putting forward. Some of the audience here, these are what I guess what's been proposed and what then I pass through my process and recommended. And you all know that I've put in a narrative form, line by line, of these drivers and my rationale for recommending what I have and what I've not recommended be funded and things. Let me at least highlight one of the things that I think public safety, anything having to do with the radio system, since we've now got a consultant on board, with certainly with everybody's agreement, I've consolidated all those projects under the emergency radio system project, because we don't want to necessarily be buying communications equipment that may be in conflict or a not wise expenditure until we know kind of what maybe a long-term solution will be. And that'll run through. At the bottom, the last page shows kind of the breakout of where things are and where I've made my reductions. But generally speaking, on the capital side, anything that I would call as a bondable project, one of these big ticket projects either for the schools or for sort of emergency communications, are things that I've deferred out because there needs to be a good, healthy debate about how we go about funding those projects. But there's just not enough money in this budget to be able to undertake any of those. And the county may have gotten to the point where pay-as-you-go for some of these larger projects, particularly like landfill, where it just cash is just not available to take down those projects or accumulate over some years. The next one, certainly for our friends and colleagues with the schools are here, is when I asked Matt to prepare this sheet, there was a little bit of a method to my madness, and I do appreciate you doing that. And with Dr. Grimacy, is that this really kind of boiled down to me how to get my handle on the school's budget. What are the local dollars going to do? And so anything in yellow is where I've derived the bottom line number. So the VRS, group life insurance, those are those are contractual. You generally don't have much discretion. Locust Grove Elementary School was something I certainly heard from a lot of folks, and that's a policy decision that this board, in collaboration with the school board, will deal with. The technology resource teachers and I think you heard a number of folks that having guidance teachers do that may not be the best allocation of personnel based on where they are, and that this is something, again, not to miss an opportunity. This is what I would actually identify as an unfunded mandate for the most part from this General Assembly. And then certainly keeping the schools moving on their salary improvement plan. So that's how the schools number came about. And I just wanted to make sure there's transparency on that. Next slide. Yeah.
This one is just an overview of the last couple of years and the overall changes in the budget. You remember that FY13 was a reassessment year, so we did try to fund some capital that had been deferred in previous years. So there was an increase that year of 6.7. Last year, we really worked hard to not be using our fund balance, and so we actually reduced the overall budget by 2%. And this year, the proposed budget includes a variance of $4 million, or 7.6% overall. Now, the next section just focuses on general fund revenues. And this is something that we had looked at briefly, I think, in our tax work session a couple of years ago. But I thought there was some interesting information here just for your background on trends in the county's tax base. But this is comparing 2005 to 2014 real estate values by class. And so you have the different classes. There are 3 different classes of residential. There's commercial, industrial, and 2 classes of agricultural. And just looking at the change between 2005 and 2014, you see that the suburban class of residential has gone down from 65 to 62. The changes, I don't know, I found them interesting, and they surprised me a little. Our commercial actually increased by 1%, and agricultural in the 20 to 99 acres actually increased the most by 2%. So for what it's worth, I just thought it was interesting. The next one puts a different perspective on it, showing the real estate tax levies by type. And again, comparing the same 2 years, 2005 to 2014. And you can see that in 2005, residential was at 76%. In 2014, it's at 77%. And again, agriculture is the area that went down from 17% of the actual tax revenue being billed from 17% to 15%. And then commercial industrial went up by 1% as well there. One of the things that's driving that, I think, are the tax deferments. And I had this information on the tax deferments for land use. So I thought I would share that. And you can see that since 2005, they have increased in terms of the dollars. But when you look at it as a percent of the entire revenue levy, it hasn't been that dramatic a change. I think another area that's not included here are the easements, conservation easements, and the credits for the elderly and the handicapped and the veterans. So all of those come into play in those other 2 slides as well as this. And I asked the commissioner for that information, but I just didn't get it in time to include it.
Let me ask a question about your 2 previous slides.
Okay.
I'm looking at the 2 categories of agricultural making up, in 2014, 18% of the assessed value, and making up 15% of the real estate tax revenue. So it's not nearly as dramatic a difference as I would have thought. Thank you.
Going on to the values of a penny on each tax rate. I'm comparing them to the 2007 values because that was before the reassessment. So you can see that we're still not back at our former values. A penny on the real estate is still worth $371,000. It's a little better than the prior year, but not $485,000 still. And the other categories have not changed significantly. They're up slightly, but by far real estate is the big revenue producer. This is just a chart of our tax rates as they are now and as they have been proposed. And you can see that the only change has been proposed to the real estate rate from 72 cents per hundred to 80.4 cents per hundred.
And as you just referenced back to that balance or that spreadsheet, you could see how we got very transparently to that 80 cents.
The next slide is just an example of the tax rate's impact on property owners. We really updated a chart that we had when we went through the reassessment This time, the values aren't changing, it's only the rate. But we did add a couple of extra years on there for you, and we also added a column for the monthly change in taxes due as well as the annual. And you can see that as far as a monthly increase, for people that have it included in their escrows for their mortgages, it ranges from, you know, $6.72, I think, up to about $28 per month. This is just the total estimated tax revenue for tax year 2014. And you can see that all the categories combined make up about $37 million. This is the overview of all general fund revenue sources, showing the local revenue, which includes those taxes, the state revenue, federal revenue, which there's never very much of, the transfers in from other funds, and the use of reserves. And they make up our total sources of revenue in the general fund. As you can see, we're expecting a very minimal increase in state revenue. Our local revenue does include that 8.4 cents tax rate increase, but altogether with our organic growth, that generates $4.1 million. This next one is just a slide of basically the same information, showing you again how very dependent we are on our general property taxes, because they make up 68% of our general fund revenue. This one is a little more detail on the general fund revenues, and I won't really belabor them. I think you can see that the same dynamics are going on here with the big increase being in the real estate category due to the rate increase proposed. These are the increases in our general fund revenue. Again, the revenue from the tax rate increase, the very top line, $3.1 million. That's totally from the rate increase. The next largest area of growth was in sales tax, and that's $243,750. That includes new estimates as a result of what we're seeing so far with Walmart. The next line is our organic real estate property revenue growth at $201,000, and it goes down the list from there. I have increased the estimate for ambulance and rescue service fees. We have seen a large improvement this year from where we were last year. We had some problems, and the billing company had some issues with Medicare and processing paperwork through hospitals and so forth. So there was a delay, but it seems to have picked right back up. So we were able to increase our revenue estimate there. So our total increases with the tax revenue, 4.3. These are the decreases in the general fund revenue. And the first one is the surplus property sales. And I did lower the estimate there. It seemed to be, it had been budgeted at $150,000 a year for several years, and we just aren't realizing that much in those surplus property sales. And we did work with Henry Lee Carter's office on an estimate that they thought was more in line. So all that's been incorporated into this budget. I also reduced the estimates on the interest on bank deposits, just based on the fact that they continue to go down. The shared expense reimbursements from the state. This is basically the registrar reimbursements and the comp board reimbursements in this category. And the governor's budget and I think the Senate and the House versions of the budget that have been proposed are, just don't offer much in the way of any kind of increases. So in our case, for the current budget year, the final adopted budget did not come up to our estimated revenue for the shared expenses. So that's why you're seeing a decrease there, because I'm really having to true it up with what it should have been this year.
I looked at the VACO alert today, and there was one thing about changing the per diem rate in the jail that would drop our, raise our costs there by about 11,000. That's not in this figure, I'm sure, nor the potential requirement to provide retirees with life insurance. Those are not in here. Okay. Again, they're helpful, General
Right.
Assembly.
Right. And you can see the smaller decreases there for total decreases in general fund revenue of 169,000. This just shows the net change in general fund revenue and other sources, and it's just given a summary of the previous slide. Breeze by that one. And these are our non-local revenue sources. I tried to break it out a little bit more than I have in the past so that you can see the compensation board funding, the communications tax funding, which, as you recall from last year, we reclassified from a local tax to a non-categorical state aid, as hard as that was to swallow. But Comprehensive Services Act is historically been a large part of the state aid, and personal property tax relief, which has been constant for this entire period since 2009. This is just a chart showing you those numbers, so.
Yep. All right. As you know, there's a little over 8 cents that balances this budget on increase on real estate. One of the things that you also saw in that budget balancer is what 1 penny generates versus personal property. So I think in order to get to where we needed to be, real estate was really the only viable way of raising those revenues. And what are those revenues being raised for? I think that is a very, very important part of this discussion. As you all know, and certainly has been communicated to me since I arrived, is that there's a lot of pressure, particularly on capital equipment, capital facilities for you all that are needed. And a lot of that is in the public safety world. A lot of that is in schools, and certainly solid waste collection and disposal. These are costs that don't go away, and in fact, the more they're deferred, the more expensive typically they get to be. And so I think we're at a crossroads now of how do we, in a reasonable, rational way, start building capacity in the budget. So it's as best as we can tell right now, it's a way to take care of these needs going forward, to provide the services that the citizens expect, particularly in the public safety world and as well as school. Next slide. But in the budget that I proposed to you all with that increase, there are certain other projects that you all certainly are very well aware of, and I'll again go back to the budget documentation. These capital projects have been thought through. Now, where are they in the priority? That's something this board and working with staff as well as your partners in the schools need to work through. Are these the right numbers? These are the best estimates that are right here before us right now, but these are not funded by this budget. These projects are not funded by this budget. These are what I call bondable projects. The way you get to figuring out how much and when is this long-term financial plan that I certainly am recommending that you all undertake. As that plan is developed, you would spend monies to engage qualified architects and engineers to get you a good financeable estimate, one that you could actually go to finance, and that takes some cash outlays up front. The wise use of your capital project fund will allow you to seed fund those as long as you do a reimbursement resolution at the time that you start that process, so that when you get to the point of financing, you can reimburse yourself for those outlays, reimburse the capital projects fund, and then you start the process back over after you've done that. So these are projects that are out there, and there could be, and I know the county attorney is coming back, public-private partnerships. There may be, particularly with buildings, there may be an opportunity to engage the private sector to bring things in a much more, in a faster way, and maybe with some economies than we could on a design-build approach. Next slide. Certainly there are personnel needs out there. I think the budget has done what I think should be done. And you know, I can go through, but one of the things that I do want to touch on, I'm not sure where, but this may be an appropriate place. I've recommended that the county engage a qualified consultant to do a market pay and reclassification study, finding out where our pay plan is in the competitive market. In the budget is a fund. I've called it Market Study and Reclassification Fund. It's equal to 2% cost of living, or 2% salary increase for everyone. And so there's an ability for about 15,000 is what I have as a planning number to engage. Springstead has done this before, so they may be a qualified consultant to go test the market, find out where we are, also look at some specific positions that may need to be aligned with their current duties. The fact that Springstead has already done all the bulk of the classification work should make it a low-cost endeavor. The results of that study then could be implemented through this 2%, this fund that I've established in the budget. My recommendation is that if the disparity between where the market is and where the pay plan or where positions are and adjustments, 2% is what this budget can bear. If you can't get it all done this year, then that certainly sets you up to undertake the balance of it as a next year's budget cycle. But that's how I've structured on salary and compensation issues. You really want to know where you are in the market. I think that's a good practice. School board request, I think we've gone through that and how I arrived at that. The reimbursements to constitutional officers, I think you can kind of work through what that all is. Well, kick me if I'm going to go through these slides too quickly and you wanted to point out, but I think a lot of this is just restating a lot of this in either a graphic or a tabular form, and so we can kind of go through the expenditures and the variances, and then I'll let Glenda go through this next section here, probably pretty quickly, because it just shows you what's coming in and out of the general fund.
Right. This slide really focuses on the general fund transfers, which is, if I go back a couple of slides, the highlighted line, which is the biggest category in these sub-function categories within the general fund. So you see that for the proposed year, it's $34,000 that's going to be going out of the general fund to be spent in other funds, and this is the detail of where that money's going. So you can see that 20.2 is a contribution to the school operating fund that's proposed. That is an increase of $1.2 million, or 6.7%. We also have an increase to social services fund of $89,188, or 10%. An increase to the capital projects fund of 86.7%, and trying to catch up on some of those capital needs. Debt service fund, that amount is going down some, as you can see. And the airport fund shows a reduction here in the general fund transfer. The fund itself, is, you'll see later on, has an increase, but the actual local contribution to the airport fund is down. And that really is a function of the capital projects and the timing of those. The landfill fund is up by $511,000, and most of that, again, is related to capital. In the current year's budget, we did not fund any capital in the landfill fund. We had done a lot of heavy capital spending there in the previous years, and we had 1 year break there. You can see that the total variance is $2.3 million, or 7.4%. This is just a graph of those same transfers. Because they're so different in the amounts, I had to put them on 2 slides, so I put the largest 3 on this slide and the smallest 3 on this slide. And I think this one says something with the orange line, in that we really would like to get to a place where we can
Steady
add
that
some
out.
stability to our capital funding. So that's an interesting one. Again, the local contribution to the schools is the largest line item in the general fund. It makes up 58.6% of that transfers category. This is just a review of our funding for FY14 for school funding, and shows that the original adopted budget, the operating contribution was $18.9 million, which was a 1.7% increase, and capital was steady at $417,000. That was the same as previous year. We did do some supplemental appropriations during the year that brought our grand total up. That's a little out of alignment there at the bottom of that slide, but the grand total for the school appropriations for the current year is $21,038,059. This one shows the requested for 2015. It was a requested increase of 1.8 million, or 9.8%, and there's a requested increase of 150,000 for the part of the master plan project related to the track at the high school. What is proposed is down below, an increase of 1.2 million, and we have worked the 150,000 in as well, for a total increase of 1.4 million. This one shows the required local effort, and this just comes off the templates that are provided by the Department of Education. But as you know, they have SOQ requirements, and these are the amounts that they determine through that formula are the required local effort. We are well in excess of that, and you can see that the proposed for 15 will be about $9.5 million in excess of that required contribution.
All right, the next slide are the external entities, and as you all know, there are a lot of nonprofits that you fund, maybe not a lot of money, and then there are some other entities, governmental entities, that you fund for contracted services, so to speak. And there is an increase that primarily driven by the jail expansion, both on the capital side and an operations side. You are been aware of that coming, and so this budget does take care of that. Your next slide shows you kind of what you had adopted in 14, what's requested, what I've proposed, and the variance. Generally speaking, I've kept everything level except for a few differences, and we certainly can discuss some of the discretionary. Legal, there are some that I call contracted services, when you really have an obligation to fund. The next slide is just a recap, and $447,000. That's what it takes for this county to have contracted for jail services, and that is significant. Certainly, there's a repair project on the exit road from the collection site at the Lake of the Woods, and I went and saw it myself, and so certainly understood the request if that collection, if the county was operating that inside or out, then, maintenance of an access road is certainly something that comes under it, but I'll leave it to you all to discuss that further. Juvenile detention, we have a favorite one here, Culpeper. They decreased it by 10,000, which we want to point out and certainly recognize a decrease in from the health department and such. But generally speaking, we're keeping in track, except for the jail, generally where we've been. And here's just a graphic of that. And the next slide is the contractual, and you can see where that large jump is driven generally by the jail. Next slide, certainly want to say reductions are a good thing. VRS has been good to us this year, certainly coming down our rate. I certainly want to recognize, and I told the county attorney before he left today that we'll put him up on a slide, but he's been able to reduce his budget just because of the way he's working, I think, very well for this county in his capacity, and we were able to do a lot more things in-house than I think the county had been doing in the past, and certainly the electoral board. Next slide has to do with the personnel changes and adjustments. As you all know, it's been mandated, these Tier 1, Tier 2, and hybrid employees, and we've talked about short-term and long-term disability, but that budget impact is in this year's budget, and we've taken care of it, as well as the VRS. I've talked about the compression issues and workload increase, service demands, and how we're going to at least look at that. This next slide, let me at least walk you through a little bit of my rationale with this. When I met with the Commonwealth's attorney, one of the things that certainly jumped out to me was their caseload is up over 150%. And so that certainly says that there are a lot more prosecutions, certainly at the circuit court level and at the general district court level. And as you all are aware, the Commonwealth's attorney is by law required to prosecute at the circuit court level. The Commonwealth's attorney does not have to have representation for the Commonwealth at the general district level. I think there may be some exceptions to that, but as a general rule. And so one of the things that she and I talked about, it was very important for her to have staffing aligned with her caseload, both at the circuit and the general district court. And there's a lot of good reasons, and we can talk about that during your budget work sessions. But I felt certainly comfortable in recommending to you all to fund another assistant Commonwealth's attorney based on the information she gave. Also, the sheriff and the chief deputy and I have had a number of conversations. I have to certainly commend the sheriff and his chief deputy on giving me all the information in a very timely, particularly the chief deputy. I asked him, I said, well, if you're going up on two people, patrol officers, then the overtime's got to go to 0, right? And that, I don't think, was generally the answer. But we engaged in that good discussion. It is not a dollar-for-dollar offset. So if you hire more deputies, it's not going to reduce dollar-for-dollar your overtime, but it actually starts containing some of that. Remember back to my guiding principle of cost containment. The 911 supervisor gets this back to a full-time complement of 10, and I think that will, maybe more so than the sheriff's office, have a good correlation with reduction in overtime. Certainly landfill collections driver, I think Mr. Hildebrand certainly made a convincing case to me of the ability for the supervisor to manage, I forget, quite a few collection sites, but also having to now have to jump behind the wheel of a collection truck kind of limits his supervising. And then last, given the county's focus on economic development, given its desire to move into kind of the next level of economic development, I really think, given the population size, what you're trying to do, that having 2 full-time staff devoted to economic development is very appropriate. Just from even having somebody call up and having a person there to answer the phone, I think is very meaningful. So that's why I recommended it, and it wasn't creating a new position, it was converting a part-time to a full-time. Next slide is just how this all nets out. Next slide is just the detail on this, and I've talked about the adjustments and how we go. Next slide, this gets all into the graphics of how these all play out, particularly with the red, are the ones that change. All right, and that brings us to the airport fund. And I'll let Tony
Okay.
take that.
In the airport fund, you can see that the increase in operations is 35,000, and that's up 6.11%. However, that is really less than the increase in the fuel expense, which, as you know, we recoup through the revenue. So it's a little misleading there because it's not a true increase. The capital part of the airport fund is up by $375,000, but the county's contribution to that capital is actually $16,500 less than it was in the current year. The airport projects that are included in the 15 budget.
Let me hit that one again. What is the contribution to the airport fund capital? You say 16.5 less than current. Was this
Right.
is this the 375 the total amount, or is that the
It's the total, that is the total amount, and that 375 includes the state and federal funds.
okay, so we're only a small fraction of that.
Right,
Thank you.
right. It's on the budget driver sheet on the very bottom.
Understand, I just,
The projects that are included in the airport fund for the current year for capital are the continuance of land and easement acquisition, the completion of the perimeter fencing, and the airfield remarking. These are just some of the achievements for the airport, and some of these are out of the annual report, so you've seen them before, but it does seem that they are continuing to grow. They're doing well in the fuel sales. These 38 planes are currently based there. 39 planes are on a waiting list, and 19 are on a waiting list for the old hangars, and 19 planes are on a waiting list for new hangars. Both those numbers are up from last year. So the airport seems to be growing. Capital projects, one project that was completed is the rehabilitation of the hangar taxi land.
Yeah.
Okay, in the landfill fund, operations are increasing by about 166,000. And there you can see once again that we have proposed to spend 411,000 in capital this year, and we did not appropriate any capital in the current budget year. These were the significant increases in operations and capital. Leachate management was the big one in operations, as well as the additional driver position, but you can see leachate management is up by 85,000. The additional driver cost about 39,000, and then the capital outlay, of course, was the largest increase. In the landfill, they opened and began operations of their new landfill cell. They redesigned the scale house for efficiency and installed a generator for emergency power there. They also have installed this year a Goodwill collection container for citizens' convenience. This one just shows the capital projects funding and comparing it, the current year's capital project funding to the proposed capital project funding. And it also breaks it down by funding source. So you can see the general fund portion, which is coming from tax revenue and other general fund revenues, as well as state, federal, proposed financing proceeds, donations for projects that we think we'd like to do and would be able to be financed by donations. And you can see the variance at the bottom there. These numbers do include the schools, the county portion of the school capital. So basically the 417 and the 150 are in these numbers.
You've walked them through.
These are the capital projects that are included here in the proposed budget, and I have color-coded ones that have a little bit of a difference, some other revenue source. For instance, the Gator there is donations only, because we think it would be worthwhile for our fire and EMS department to have that for events and such, but it's probably an item that they'll be able to get some donations for, so that's in there, but to be funded by donations. The ones in green there near the bottom are for the landfill fund. The blue is the airport. Then moving on to the next slide.
Oh, on the left-hand side is the shorthand for the department that is, like INSP is inspections, sheriff, fire, EMS, and so forth, Orange County Public Schools.
At the top, near the top of this one, you'll see in gray, there's 500,000 there, and that is for the replacement of 2 ambulances. We have included those in the proposed budget, but we've included them on a 3-year lease purchase, so the debt service payments are about $176,100. So they're included, they're funded, but not at the full $500,000.
And what that does is it sets you up to have that capacity, all things being equal, built into this budget, so that at the end of the 3-year term, that debt service will be available to then acquire other replacement. And it gets you on that kind of scheduled process of replacing this rolling stock.
Again, near the bottom of that sheet, the blue are airport projects and the green are landfill again. This is just an overview of historical general fund capital funding. Moving on to debt service. This first one shows our outstanding debt by entity. So we have the county, the schools, the nursing home, and then I did include the line for the total debt service just so you can see that. This is the total amounts outstanding. So you can see that we're 90 million or so with all of our debt at the present time, but that begins to fall off, and in FY21 there's a significant reduction in the school's piece of that debt. These are the actual debt service payments, so you can see how each entity's debt will fall off over time, and I just took it out to FY25. This doesn't go quite out as far, but just to give you an idea of the years that are coming up, how our debt service will be falling off. The estimated payments for FY15 do include that additional debt service payment for the 2 ambulances. So.
And just one other point, when you start developing your long-term financing plan, the timing of this debt coming off and that freeing up that capacity should be taken into account, and your financial advisors will be more than able to kind of timing on all of this. Thank you.
This is just more, sort of an overall view of how debt service payments are changing in each of the categories.
This next slide was something that I asked Davenport, your financial advisors, and with Glenda's help, to give you an idea of what, when I talk about bonding and bonding documents, what 1 penny on the real estate rate, not just because that's the largest generate, what you can do for different terms and a different interest rate, what 1 cent will do as far as capital. And when you fund these projects, you're getting all the funds plus capitalized interest and issuance fees rolled into that number to allow you to do the project right away instead of, and there are different techniques with buying down or how much you have to borrow and things like that, but I thought this would be a good bit of information for you all when you start thinking about how to take on some of these large capital projects. This next one is right per your policy, and this also plays into your bonding and your financial underwriting. The ability to balance your budget without using the fund balance by keeping sufficient reserves is good cash management, but it also speaks to your credit worthiness, and that helps reduce the interest rate that you would be charged, which then saves the taxpayer dollars on these projects.
This one just shows the history of our fund balance. This is the total general fund balance over the last number of years since 2004, as opposed to the unreserved, unappropriated fund balance. But just to give you an idea of what the total is and the trend. We also have to take into account our general cash balances, which is not quite the same thing as the fund balance, because the fund balance we really usually only measure it once a year at the end of the fiscal year. So when you're thinking about making some of these large purchases and decisions, we really need to take into consideration our cash flow as well as just that snapshot on that June 30th day. So you can see that our lean time is always in October, and then as we get through that second billing, that's the second half of the real estate and all the personal property, our cash balances are the highest at the end of December. This is just a status update on our fiscal stability reserve status, and you remember that at June 30th, our unassigned general fund balance was $18.2 million. That was 21.2%. As a percentage of the FY14 budget, when we take off the 15% and the 3%, and then the supplemental appropriations that we've done for carry forwards in 14, as well as I know there's been one that I can think of, other appropriation for the ambulance that also was funded with fund balance. We've now kind of gone into that additional 3% by $60,370. So at December 31st, we had a total of 2.9 in general fund balance that had been appropriated for the current fiscal year. And it is short of the 18% by $60,000. We'll do another review, of course, as we go into another year end of our fiscal year, and in December, we would like to suggest that if we are able to add something to fund balance, that the board consider allocating any excess reserves to the capital improvement fund.
Yeah, let me underscore that, is that anything that is one-time or excess or things should be driven to the capital projects fund to keep building that as your trust fund, as your endowment, to be able to start taking on some of these larger projects. This slide just shows you how we got
to a balanced budget. Our original forecasted shortfall was 5.1 million. That was back in November. Then when our actual request came in, between revenues and expenditures, we were short by 5.8 million. The CIP projects that were deferred or financed were 2.1 million, and that was mainly those large projects that we didn't feel like were pay-as-you-go eligible. The debt service for the 2 new ambulances, I've subtracted that, and then the reduction of the operational budget drivers was 525,000. There were additional positions that were not proposed for funding for 272,000, and then the real estate tax increase of 3.1. So those things plus the $3,400 there at the end get us to a balanced budget.
This next slide is just, I guess, the negative imagery of what was funded, what was not funded based on the request. And so I think you can go down through this and you know, I had to make some choices, and these was the net effect, and not necessarily that maybe some of these won't coming back in another budget cycle, but you all will take what I've recommended and certainly prioritize that. These next ones are just how all the consolidated numbers, I mean, we're getting right close to the end here, but this is, and Glenda's, I think, done a good job of slicing and dicing this any number of ways that you want to look at it. And then the entity on the debt service, that's the conclusion. I think we're down here at the end. Again, just like I had started, I couldn't have gotten to you tonight as quickly as I think I could have if it weren't for Glenda, Connie, all the finance staff, the department heads, the constitutional officers. Everything came of being prepared, and then it was working through of how we were going to get it done. I certainly want to compliment you all as board members of be very open with me, and I think we've established a good communication here in this last couple months about budgets, about your viewpoints, certainly in our one-on-one discussion and as a collective, and you all have given me good guidance, which is needed because I didn't have a lot of the background information to get to you tonight. I think that concludes it. I will do one for Ms. Abs. She said I needed to put a disclaimer out. This is only my opinion. You all will have 5 opinions that we'll need to get to at least a majority. So anyhow, that wanted to, you know, this is very serious stuff, and I don't want to make too much light of it, but it's been a pleasure bringing this to you at this point. So,
oh, it's been a pleasure.
well, let me rephrase that.
I wore good shoes today. So.
Let me restate that, please, if the press could retract that. I've had a pleasure working with everyone to get to this point tonight. This is tough stuff. I don't want to diminish that.
Well, I would still like to make it clear, as I have made it several times in the past, that we have a new administrator, and all of a sudden a big tax jump. And I want to make sure everybody knows that it's not the new administrator, but it's the past.
It's the past administrator?
No. It's the past this group up here that sort of set him up for this thing. But I think he's done a good job of putting this together in terms of priorities and stuff. And we'll get at it in more detail later.
Well, and I think one of the drivers too, over the last several years, we've used fund balance. We've done other things that helped us get through without raising the taxes we really needed to raise because of the situation of the economy, and it's caught up. So,
and I described to someone last night that we find this year we're almost in a double whammy situation. I mentioned this to Brian this morning. Is we're an ambulance is a good example where we're having to not only make the replacement, but we have to put in place the funding mechanism to make the subsequent replacement, and we have to do that all now. Otherwise, the problem just continues
Just
to
starts,
mushroom.
comes up again, just
And-
recycles.
And there are any number of examples like that, that we're, you know, we're gonna be juggling and setting priorities according to.
And this presentation will be on the website for individuals who can offer us specific individual recommendations.
I'd also like to add one thing. We voted the other evening to lease the old airport terminal to a flight school. That flight school now has 4 instructors. So it's a very wise decision on the board's part. It is generating more tax revenue, bringing more economic development in. So any of these small things that everyone can do as a whole truly helps in the long run. And the young lady is ecstatic about
Good,
it.
good.
She's
We like to
good.
keep our businessmen happy.
Absolutely.
And women.
I don't have any questions.
I don't have anything, yeah, it's.
It's a lot
There's a
to
large
do.
truck
it's
that just
three-
backed up.
three-
I-
three
I feel
folks
sick.
Well, I will say one thing, when Brian reached out to all of us and said he wanted to meet with us each individually, and, we were going through everything yesterday, and I was sitting there and I was going, making the faces, I said, look, this is great, I get to do them today where nobody can see me making the faces. So, I will say that, that was actually nice, because in previous years, I mean, while we kinda got a little tidbit, here and there, but to actually have Brian and Glenda sit down yesterday and,
One-on-ones.
take the time and do a one-on-one, with us, I mean, that's definitely something I know going forward we should keep doing, and I know, you're gonna do the same if you haven't already. And at 6:30 at Anytime Fitness with Dr. Bob doesn't count, so.
We had the movie trailer this morning about that, so.
Glad to help. Well, actually, that's okay, cause I did it with Bob, but I said, did you hear how much money put in the budget for you? So, he kinda got a look.
He ran it harder, didn't he?
I would move that we adjourn.
Well, before we do
Yes.
that,
Yeah, we need to talk about the, budget meeting,
Tuesday at
Tuesday.
5, that's been scheduled for some time, and then you have your steering committee at Route 3 at 3:30. So.
unless you meet really fast and drive really quick, you're not gonna be here.
I'm not gonna make it by
Well, I
5.
thought they said 3:30 to 4.
Well,
Okay.
but, if you wanna move it back to, say, a 6 o'clock start time or something like that, or you've also got your retreat coming up that's dealing with financial issues. I mean, there's a lot of things on the plate.
Are you implying then not to meet on Tuesday?
No,
or-
I-
No, I think we.
I think-
Just
I think-
changing the time
Time
because they
adjustment.
both have.
Okay,
Yeah.
he was just saying, then you're gonna meet.
Yeah, I wanna get a sense of the board, if the sense is we'll meet, but
Alright, then
maybe
let's do it at 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock, that'll
Sold.
work.
Okay, everybody in agreement?
Yep.
Then I have a motion, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?